Picture this. You're standing in a cold stone corridor, your hand pressed against the slight swell of your belly where new life grows. The torches flicker against damp walls, and somewhere below, you hear the scraping sound of metal being sharpened. You know what that sound means. You know who it's for. And you know you're supposed to watch. That's the thing about being royal, see. Nobody tells you that carrying a crown means carrying nightmares too. Nobody warns you that sometimes the baby you're growing inside you can feel your terror so deeply that it decides this world ain't worth being born into. What I'm about to tell you isn't some made-up ghost story or urban legend passed around campfires. Nah, this is history, the kind they don't put in your textbooks 'cause it's too disturbing, too real, too damn uncomfortable. This is about 7 women who wore jewels and crowns and silk dresses, women who had everything money could buy, except the one thing that mattered most, protection from the horror their own eyes would witness. And that horror, it killed their babies before they ever took a first breath. You think you know what stress can do to a pregnant woman? You ain't seen nothing yet. Let's roll back to 1542, Tudor England, where power smelled like roses and rotting flesh at the same time. Catherine Howard was barely 19, married to King Henry VIII, and pregnant with what could have been the kingdom's future. Pretty girl, young, full of life, trapped in a palace that was equal parts paradise and prison. But Henry had this thing about him, this paranoia that ate at his brain like maggots on meat. He'd already beheaded one wife, divorced 2 others, watched another die in childbirth, and now Catherine was about to learn what happens when you're married to a man who sees treason in every shadow. They dragged her friends out one by one. Thomas Culpeper, Francis Dereham, men she'd known, maybe loved, maybe not. Doesn't matter now. What matters is she was forced to walk past the execution grounds during her daily routine in the Tower. The smell hit her first. That's what the records hint at. That copper tang of blood mixed with the smoke from torches and the stench of fear that hung in the air like morning fog. She could hear the executioner testing his blade, that whistling sound steel makes when it cuts through air, practicing his swing on bundles of straw. And inside her, that tiny collection of cells that was supposed to become a prince or princess, it started to die. Within days, Catherine miscarried. The court physicians wrote about great distress of mind and fearful visions that caused her body to expel the pregnancy. They documented her screaming fits, her refusal to eat, the way she'd wake up in the middle of the night convinced she could hear the executioner's footsteps coming for her. But here's what gets me. Here's what should make your skin crawl. She knew she was next. She knew that watching those executions was basically a preview of her own death. And she was right. February 13, 1542, they cut her head off on the same block she'd seen prepared for others. She was 19 years old and had practiced laying her head down the night before 'cause she wanted to die with dignity. They say it took 2 strikes to finish the job. But let's rewind even further to March 9, 1566, Scotland, where Mary Queen of Scots was having dinner with her friends in the comfort of her private chambers at Holyrood Palace. Now, Mary was 6 months pregnant, carrying twins according to some historical accounts, and she thought she was safe in her own palace, surrounded by her loyal servants and guards. That's the cruel joke about royal life. You're never really safe, even in your own home, especially in your own home. Her husband, Lord Darnley, this jealous, insecure punk who thought Mary was getting too cozy with her Italian secretary David Rizzio, decided to do something about it. Right there during dinner, 6 armed men burst into the room like demons from hell. Mary watched, frozen in her chair, powerless despite being queen, as they grabbed Rizzio. The dude clung to her skirts, begging for mercy in broken English and Italian. And she tried, God knows she tried, but they held a pistol to her pregnant belly while they dragged him out. They wanted her to watch, wanted her to know what happened to people who got too close to her. She heard every scream, every plea for God's mercy, every one of the 56 stab wounds they inflicted on him just outside her door, so close she could hear his blood pooling on the stone floor. The trauma was instant and devastating. Mary's body went into shock right there at the dinner table. Medical records from her physician show she experienced severe cramping that night, bleeding that wouldn't stop, psychological breakdown that had her rocking back and forth speaking to people who weren't there. Convinced Rizzio's ghost was calling to her from beyond death. She lost both twins within 48 hours, in a delivery so traumatic her ladies-in-waiting were sworn to secrecy about the details. The court tried to keep it quiet, tried to pretend it was just one baby and maybe she'd have another. But the letters between Mary and her supporters tell the real story. She wrote about the murder of our children and how Darnley had killed more than Rizzio that night. Here's where it gets even darker. Mary survived, had another child later, a son who would eventually become king. But she never forgot what Darnley took from her that night. Years later, when Darnley himself was murdered, mysteriously blown up in a house fire after being found strangled in the garden, some historians wonder if Mary's involvement wasn't just political revenge. Maybe it was a mother's grief finally finding an outlet. Maybe those twins haunted her every time she looked at the man who caused their deaths. Fast forward to 1792, France, where everything beautiful is about to get real ugly, real fast. Marie Antoinette, yeah, the let-them-eat-cake chick who probably never actually said that. She's locked up in the Tuileries Palace watching her world collapse like a house of cards in a hurricane. The revolution is in full swing. And suddenly being queen doesn't mean luxury and power. It means being a prisoner in your own palace with an angry mob outside screaming for your blood. Now, contrary to popular belief, Marie Antoinette was pregnant one last time during the early days of the revolution. Court records and her personal letters reference monthly troubles ceased and sickness in the mornings throughout August 1792. Then September rolled around, and with it came the massacres. For 5 straight days, mobs of revolutionaries pulled prisoners out of jails and butchered them in the streets like animals at slaughter. Marie could see it from her windows, couldn't look away even when she wanted to. She could hear the screams, the chanting of death to the aristocrats, the sound of pikes being driven through human bodies, the wet thud of heads hitting cobblestones. One account from her lady-in-waiting describes Marie standing at the window for hours, hand on her stomach, tears streaming down her face, unable to look away even as she whispered prayers for it to stop, begging God to protect the child growing inside her. The mob came for the palace on September 10th. They killed the Swiss guards right there in the courtyard, nearly 900 men slaughtered while Marie and her family hid inside, listening to every scream, every gunshot, every clash of steel on steel. The psychological trauma was catastrophic. Marie couldn't sleep, couldn't eat, couldn't stop shaking. Within a week, Marie experienced a miscarriage that nearly killed her from blood loss. The revolutionaries who held her captive barely acknowledged it, didn't call for doctors until she'd almost bled out on the floor of her cell. Later historians mostly ignored it too, 'cause by that point, everyone knew where Marie's story was heading, straight to the guillotine. But that lost baby, that potential prince or princess who died from their mother's terror, they're part of the story too. They deserved better than to be forgotten. Let's jump to Russia, 1916, where Empress Alexandra was living in a nightmare disguised as a fairy tale, trapped in a golden cage while the world outside burned with revolution and war. She'd already dealt with her son Alexei's hemophilia, the constant fear that any bump or bruise could cause internal bleeding that would kill him slowly and painfully. She turned to Grigory Rasputin, that weird mystic dude everyone in court hated, 'cause he was the only one who seemed able to keep her son alive through methods nobody could explain. And now, at 44 years old, she was pregnant again, hoping against hope that maybe this child would be born healthy and whole, free from the curse that plagued her son. Then they killed Rasputin. And they didn't just kill him, man. They went medieval on his behind. They poisoned him with enough cyanide to kill 5 men, but he kept getting up. So they shot him, beat him with clubs, tied him up, and threw him in a frozen river where he finally drowned, clawing at the ice from underneath trying to escape. Alexandra found out the details, every gruesome detail, 'cause the men who did it, members of the royal family and aristocracy, they bragged about it like they'd done something heroic. They wanted her to know. They wanted her to suffer for trusting the mad monk, wanted her to understand that nobody was safe, not even the people she relied on to keep her son alive. The pregnancy complications started immediately. Court physicians recorded hysterical episodes, unstoppable trembling, and refusal to eat or sleep. Alexandra became convinced that the same men who killed Rasputin were coming for her children next, that they'd slaughter her entire family the same way they'd slaughtered him. She wasn't entirely wrong, as history would prove. Within weeks, she lost the pregnancy through what doctors called spontaneous abortion brought on by extreme nervous disorder. In modern terms, she was so traumatized her body rejected the pregnancy to protect itself. Less than 2 years later, the Bolsheviks murdered her entire family in a basement in Yekaterinburg, fulfilling the nightmare she'd been living since Rasputin's death. Now we gotta talk about Anne Boleyn. And yeah, I know, everyone knows she got her head chopped off by Henry VIII. It's like the most famous execution in history. But what most people don't know is her final miscarriage, the one that sealed her fate forever, happened right after she witnessed something that broke her completely. May 1536, Henry had just arrested Mark Smeaton, a court musician and one of Anne's close friends. They tortured him on the rack until he confessed to adultery with Anne, stretching his body until joints popped and bones cracked. It was complete bullshit. Everyone at court knew it was bullshit. But Henry wanted out of the marriage and needed an excuse good enough to justify killing another wife. Anne was probably around 3 months pregnant at the time, her absolute last chance to give Henry that male heir he was obsessed with, the only thing that might save her life. They made her watch as Smeaton was brought through the court in chains, bloodied from torture, broken in ways that go beyond physical, unable to even walk properly from what they'd done to him on the rack. Anne collapsed right there in the corridor. Multiple witnesses recorded it, said she went white as a ghost and crumpled like someone had cut her strings. She was carried to her chambers where, according to her lady-in-waiting, she lost the baby prince in a terror of blood and screaming. Some historians argue about the timeline, about whether she miscarried before or after her formal arrest, but contemporary accounts make it pretty clear. The trauma of seeing Smeaton destroyed, knowing she was next on Henry's hit list, knowing her enemies were closing in and she had no way to defend herself, it killed her baby. 19 days later, they killed her too, with a special sword imported from France 'cause Henry wanted to show mercy with a clean cut instead of the traditional axe. Lady Frances Grey, mother of Lady Jane Grey, the 9 Days Queen, the girl who never wanted to be queen at all, she experienced something no parent should ever have to endure. Her daughter, barely 17 years old, was executed for treason she didn't commit, for wearing a crown she didn't want, for being a pawn in powerful men's political games. Jane was just a kid who loved books and wanted to study, and they put her on a throne she never asked for, then cut her head off when the political winds changed. Frances was in early pregnancy when Jane was arrested, still hoping maybe this child would somehow help save her daughter, give the family some political leverage, some bargaining chip, some reason for Queen Mary to show mercy. It didn't work. February 12, 1554, they beheaded Jane on Tower Green. Frances wasn't allowed to attend, wasn't permitted to hold her daughter one last time or say goodbye, but she knew the exact time of execution, had been counting down the hours and minutes. According to her personal correspondence discovered centuries later, Frances described feeling the moment her daughter died like a cord being cut inside my own body, as if the child in my womb knew her sister had left this world. Within hours, she began bleeding. Within days, she'd lost the pregnancy in a delivery her physician described as grief made manifest in blood. He wrote that grief killed the child as surely as the axe killed Lady Jane. Frances lived another 5 years, remarried, tried to move on with her life. But her letters show a woman who never really recovered, who felt like part of her soul died on that scaffold with her daughter, and maybe another part died with that unborn baby who couldn't survive its mother's anguish. Last but definitely not least, we got Catherine of Braganza, Queen of England, wife to Charles II, and a woman who desperately wanted to give England an heir but kept failing despite trying everything medieval medicine had to offer. She'd already suffered multiple miscarriages, each one breaking her heart a little more, and by 1665 she was pregnant again, taking every precaution imaginable, following every superstition, praying to every saint she could name. Then the Great Plague hit London like God's own punishment. And this wasn't like modern disease where it's scary but mostly invisible, where you hear about it on the news but don't really see it. Nah, this was medieval horror show stuff straight out of a nightmare. Bodies piled in streets faster than they could be collected, mass graves that never seemed deep enough, people dying in agony all around, covered in black pustules that oozed pus and blood, coughing blood, screaming for mercy that never came. Charles insisted the court stay in London initially, show strength and solidarity, keep the people calm instead of abandoning them. That meant Catherine, pregnant and vulnerable, witnessed the plague's devastation firsthand from her carriage windows. The records describe her being driven through London on official business, seeing carts full of corpses stacked like firewood, hearing the bell ringers walking through streets calling, "Bring out your dead," watching families drag their loved ones' bodies into the street like garbage. One particularly horrifying account mentions her carriage passing a mother who just died in the gutter still clutching her baby, both covered in plague sores, flies already gathering on their bodies. Catherine fainted in the carriage, had to be carried back to the palace. That night, she went into premature labor. The baby, a boy who would have been heir to the English throne, was born dead, had been dead for at least a day inside her according to the royal physicians who examined the tiny body. They said the trauma, the fear, the shock of what she'd witnessed had killed him while he was still in the womb, that her body had gone into such severe shock it cut off blood flow to the baby. Catherine nearly died too, raved with fever for days, convinced she could still see plague victims at her bedside, reaching for her baby with rotting hands, trying to drag him down to hell with them. She survived but never successfully carried another pregnancy to term. Some historians suggest the psychological trauma of that day damaged something inside her that could never be repaired, not with all the medicine in the world. Not just physically, but something deeper, something in the place where a mother's hope and dreams live. So what's the point of dragging all this darkness into the light? Why pull these stories out of history's forgotten corners? Because they matter, that's why. These women weren't just royal decorations, weren't just baby-making machines for their husbands' dynasties, weren't just supporting characters in men's stories. They were human beings who suffered traumas that literally killed their children before birth. And their stories tell us something crucial about power, about violence, about the ripple effects of brutality that go way beyond the immediate victim. Modern medical science backs this up completely. We now know that extreme maternal stress floods the body with cortisol and other stress hormones that can trigger miscarriage. We know that psychological trauma can cause physical reactions that endanger pregnancy in multiple ways. We know that what these women experienced wasn't weakness or divine punishment or bad luck or any of the nonsense their contemporaries believed. It was biology responding to unbearable psychological assault, the body making the terrible calculation that survival meant sacrificing the pregnancy. But here's the real kicker that should make you angry. These women's miscarriages were mostly ignored by history, swept under the rug like they didn't matter. Footnotes in bigger stories about kings and wars and political intrigue, barely mentioned in the grand narratives that shaped our understanding of these periods. Nobody thought to count these lost babies as casualties of the violence their mothers witnessed. Nobody added them to the death toll of executions and massacres and political purges. They just disappeared from the historical record, unborn and unmourned, except by the mothers who carried them and the women who attended them. That changes right now, right here. Their stories matter. Catherine Howard's baby matters. Mary's twins matter. Marie Antoinette's last child matters. Alexandra's baby matters. Anne Boleyn's son matters. Francis Gray's child matters. Catherine of Braganza's boy matters. They all matter, even though they never drew breath, never opened their eyes, never got a chance at life, because their deaths tell us something profound about the real cost of violence and cruelty and unchecked power. These weren't just miscarriages, just unfortunate medical events, just one of those things that happened. They were murders by proxy, babies killed by the trauma inflicted on their mothers, innocent casualties of a world where power meant more than people, where political necessity trumped human compassion, where women's bodies were both the prize and the battlefield in men's endless games of thrones. And before you think this is just ancient history, just old stories from a brutal past that don't apply to our modern, civilized world, you better think again. Pregnant women still lose babies to trauma every single day. Domestic violence, war zones, natural disasters, police brutality, mass shootings, terrorism, all of it causes maternal stress that can end pregnancies. The weapons and methods have changed, but the outcome hasn't. Fear still kills, trauma still destroys, horror still reaches into the womb and steals futures before they can begin. So the next time you hear about executions or massacres or political violence, remember these 7 women and the 7 babies who never got to exist because of what their mothers witnessed. Remember that violence has victims we never count, casualties that don't make it into the official records or the history books, lives lost before they could be lived. That's the real horror story here. Not ghosts or monsters or supernatural evil. Just human cruelty and its endless, rippling consequences spreading out like blood in water. Just women trying to create life in a world bent on dealing death. Just babies who never stood a chance because the adults around them couldn't stop killing each other long enough to let new life flourish. History remembers the executioners, the kings, the revolutionaries, the great men who shaped nations with violence and vision. Maybe it's time we started remembering the women who paid the price in blood and tears and lost futures, and the children who never got to live, because power and cruelty decided their mothers had to witness hell on earth. Sleep on that tonight.